Hi, everyone joining us right now. Hello, happy Monday. Ooh, a lot of people are coming in really fast. This is exciting. If you're joining us, feel free, or if you're just joining us now, feel free to drop your name in the chat and where you're joining us from. Always nice to see the geographic diversity in these webinars. I know I'm probably not a familiar face to some folks that are attending this webinar, but my name is Sid. I'll do a full introduction later on too, but welcome, welcome. We have our agenda for our webinar today for our Homes Are Votes, focused around engaging folks on subsidized housing and other community members. We'll get started in about 4 or 2-ish minutes, I think. We got a lot of folks to get through today, so I want to make sure I give everyone equal and ample time to discuss, but I'll get started very shortly. And again, feel free to drop your name and where you're joining us from in the chat. We got some folks from Kansas, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, Kansas City, Florida, Washington, D.C., Baton Rouge, Louisiana, Utah, Wisconsin. Lots of geographic diversity. Awesome, awesome. South Dakota, more New Jersey folks. We have some folks from New York, Ohio, South Carolina, Washington. Awesome, cool. So for everyone that's just joining us now, we'll get started in a minute, but feel free to drop where you're joining us from in the chat. Well, I'm going to go ahead and get us started now, just because we have a really big agenda today, but a really exciting agenda. So thank you to everyone for joining today's webinar. My name is Sid Betancourt, and I'm a housing advocacy organizer with NLIHC. My pronouns are she, hers, and I'm stepping in for Courtney this week. I'm obviously not Courtney, but you will see her in the chat helping out with links and questions, and feel free to congratulate her as well. She graduated 2 years ago, but finally got to celebrate this past weekend, so big cheers to her. But today's webinar, we're going to focus on best practices for finding and registering new residents and other individuals who are eligible to vote. In the past, we've discussed how to engage residents of subsidized housing, but we're excited to include other community resources such as libraries in today's webinar. And today's panelists will include a few experts that we're excited to have on. We have Julianne Winkelstein, author of Libraries and Homelessness, an action guide, and co-editor of the American Library Association Social Responsibilities Roundtable newsletter. And we also have Jenny Garmon, Civic Engagement Specialist with the Kansas City Public Library. We also have Teresa Clark joining us from Washington Low Income Housing Alliance. She's their deputy director. And then we also have NLIHC's very own Danny Manuel, who's a senior research analyst. So today, like I said, we'll be covering voter outreach for subsidized housing and community members. And Dan will also be covering how to use the National Housing Preservation Database. And just some housekeeping items before we begin. We will allow some time at the end of today's webinar for questions, but in the meantime, please feel free to use the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen, and we'll be providing access to the recording of this video and a copy of today's slides to all participants following the webinar, and it'll also be posted to the Our Homes Are Votes website, which Courtney will drop in the chat shortly. But besides that, I will go ahead and turn it over to our first two panelists for today, Julie and Jenny. I will turn it over to you two to begin.
Hi, everyone. I'm Julianne Winkelstein. I'm My pronouns are she and her, and I'm currently stably housed. I'm glad to be here today with Jenny Garman to talk about the role of libraries in voting. Could you go to the, I just remember that I'm not in charge of my own slides. Can you go to the next slide? Yeah, thank you. All right. And I just wanted to mention that if you have any questions or comments about libraries and voting, feel free to put them in the chat or in the Q&A. And there was something else. Oh, I'm speaking to you from right now from Albany, California. Next slide. So my focus right now as a librarian educator and past public librarian for 20 years, it has always been on the social justice work that we do in public libraries or in libraries in general. And the challenges such as the librarian stereotype and just the general stereotype of what libraries do that gets in the way of keeps organizations and institutions from reaching out to us and asking us to partner. So my goal in life is to emphasize what great partners we make. And many of you may already be doing that. And it would be great if you are doing that, if you would put it in the chat or feel free to email me. My email is on the last slide because I'm trying to collect as much information as I can about that. I teach a graduate level library school class called The Role of Libraries in Addressing Homelessness and Poverty. And my students in my class are committed to addressing that topic and related social justice topics in their library work. And on this slide, I have examples of the myriad groups and authors in the library world who are doing their part in addressing social and societal inequities. The American Indian Library Association, the Asian Pacific American Library Association, the Association of Bookmobile and Outreach Services, the Association for Rural and Small Libraries, the Joint Council of Librarians of Color, and many, many more are working with librarians, libraries, and communities to make this a more fair and just world. The three books here that are on this slide are written about, first one is on the left, is about social workers and a trauma-informed approach to working with people experiencing homelessness in libraries. The one in the middle is librarians who work with people who are incarcerated or are post-incarceration. And then I have this book on the right that's a general book about homelessness in libraries, which includes a section on voting because I think it's very important. So I'm really happy to have this opportunity to talk about what we do in libraries as it relates to voting. We understand as libraries the critical importance of voting on all levels, local, statewide, and national. And we provide support in many ways. And we make great partners, in case I didn't already say that. Next slide. This is an example of what the Social Responsibilities Roundtable, which is part of ALA, an event that we put on called the Afternoon of Social Justice. It's free. We're actually doing another one this year. We did another one last year, in fact. And if you're interested, you could email me and you could attend it, even if you didn't have to be a librarian or be part of the American Library Association to attend it. So this one was the Afternoon of Social Justice. We had three parts to it: Native American treaty rights, democracy in the time of COVID-19, and looking at activism. And democracy in the time of COVID-19 is the one that I organized, and it was about, it was a panel discussion about voting in the United States. Next slide. I also worked with the, I also worked with the Government Documents Roundtable of American Library Association to create a webinar about voting and libraries. And it was an hour-long webinar that included representatives of Turvo Vote, which is part of Democracy Works, Vote Writers, and ABC Vote. I highly recommend watching the webinar to learn about these organizations and how they see libraries being a part of the work that they do. Next slide. For this webinar today, I reached out on various library listservs and said, hey, I'm doing this presentation. Could you give me examples of what you do in your library around voting? And so these are some of the examples that I received. As you can see, there was a range of activities. Several libraries mentioned that they worked with the League of Women Voters. Many, many libraries are polling places. One library in Cheyenne, Wyoming, their Laramie County Library puts together an election notebook that has all the information that people could need locally for being able to register to vote and to be able to vote, no matter their housing status. I see that some of the graphics are different in this. Sorry about that. And then another library created a LibGuide, which is a compilation of relevant materials and an online compilation of relevant materials. And another one implemented a registration drive for people with disabilities. Brooklyn Public Library said that they've done that 3 times, and many, many more. These are just examples of registered as part of the National Voter Registration Day. The American Library Association joined with the State Library of North Carolina. Next slide. So one librarian sent me this photo of a van that is regularly scheduled to come to the library to do voter outreach. So this is in Coolidge, Arizona. And the next slide. And this is just one example of a library as a polling place. And this one is in Juneau, Alaska. So a lot of libraries have signed up to be polling places. And one of the powerful parts about being a library that's also being a polling place is that we can provide registration materials. We can provide supplementary materials. People are interested in the local or national elections. We provide information, and so that's something that comes along with being a polling place. We can provide information as well. And finally, next slide. This is just an example of one library, Sacramento Public Library in California. Libraries that can, in states where it's legal, provide drop boxes so that people can vote, even if during, for instance, at the peak of COVID-19, when many libraries were closed, they were still providing drop boxes. So this is one letter. This is an email from the Sacramento County Register of Voters to the library, thanking them, saying words can't even express what your support and the Friends of the Library participation has meant in terms of providing access to our elections, especially during the COVID-19 pandemic. Between hosting vote centers where voters can vote in person or hosting a drop box and tending to it outside during the pandemic, to your staff being all hands on deck and being willing to work with us, it means more than you know, and there's no way we would be as successful as we are without the Sacramento Public Library, period. So I hope that this gives you kind of a very brief overview of some of the ways that libraries can work with organizations, local organizations on voting, and many other ways too. And now I'm going to go on to Jenny, who will talk more specifically about the work that she does. Jenny.
Oh, Jenny, I think you're muted.
Thank you. I would have to say I'm not ready for the slide just yet, but I did want to say how excited I am to be here, just because I've heard about our homes, our votes, and how they want to provide tools and resources to housing advocates so that they can make that connection with low-income voters, help them engage with candidates. And so it's great to be here. And if you want to help all voters, I think we're all here because we do, all voters, including those low-income voters, including housing insecure voters, voters who are currently houseless. If you want to help them make that connection with their community and with their elected officials, Julie shared a lot of great reasons why your local library could be an excellent partner. As you've heard, I'm Jenny Garman. I get to be the civic engagement specialist here at the Kansas City Public Library in Missouri. In my role, I've been involved with the 2020 census, with voter engagement and registration, and helping people connect to Kansas City's elected officials and also our legal community. I work with our local election authority, the Kansas City Board of Election Commissioners, to share answers to questions like, am I eligible to vote? What's on the ballot for the next election? And I'd like to register to vote, but I'm currently houseless. What can I do? Because these are questions that we see at the library. These are questions that come to us at our desks. And honestly, if people are brave enough to ask these questions, there's a lot more people who aren't as brave to come in and ask that question. But the answers to these frequently asked questions are there to help our patrons, but also to help our staff help our patrons. I coordinate deputy registrar training for eligible library staff, and I also provide training on Missouri's voter registration postcard. I have an example of that right here. In Missouri, anybody can help register voters using this postcard, and we turn that into the Kansas City Election Board. If you're a deputy registrar, you get to use a voter registration affidavit, and you're registered as soon as the deputy registrar has signed your affidavit. One of our newest deputy registrars is Kelly Berry, and I know you're on the call today, Kelly. I'm very excited to share this because Kelly is one of our newest deputy registrars. She's also the library's community engagement specialist, community engagement outreach specialist. And Kelly's focus is on our housing insecure and homeless population. It's really amazing, Kelly, what you do every day. Kelly hosts coffee and conversation events to share community and resources with our patrons. And I'm really excited that she's able to be a deputy registrar with this new qualification. I get to join Kelly next week at Coffee and Conversation, and I'll help make sure that our patrons are registered to vote. That's our last one right before the registration deadline for our August 2nd election. So another thing that we get to do is notary public service. We started providing notary services in response to a barrier of the need to notarize mail-in ballots and some absentee ballots for the 2020 election. We've expanded that service, and we help our patrons with all sorts of notary services for free. You can make an appointment with me. You can call ahead to any one of our 10 locations to see if a notary is available, and we take care of our patrons that way. We see sometimes that patrons need to replace their vital records, which are important for really so many facets of our lives, but especially related to this, voting. Savannah Gray is an MSW intern who worked with our community resources team this past year. And she worked with team members to create a zine that would help community members understand this barrier of reacquiring your vital records, and also help people who need to replace those vital records with step-by-step instructions. And we haven't been able to post it on our website just yet, but I'm really pleased to share it with you right here. And now is a great time for that slide. I just want to highlight these just two really quick things. Savannah and the team went through and they said, here's our recommendation. If you need to replace all of your vital documents, get your birth certificate squared away first, then get your driver's license squared away, then get your social security card. And then I really love how they break down each of the steps right here for our community. And I bring it up at this point because I think it's possible for us to take for granted when you have stable housing, when you have document storage. It's hard to imagine all the steps you'd have to take to replace your vital documents. And I'm really proud of our community resources team and that they've been able to provide this help and these resources to our patrons who need them. Going back to some of the things that I get to do with outreach efforts, I bring these postcards that I showed you to my outreach events, and connect people with information about restoration of voting rights for those who have completed their sentence, probation, and parole. And I recently had the opportunity to register new citizens after our naturalization ceremony. And I've worked with UMKC's Center for Neighborhoods interns. They hosted a voter registration drive at our Daytime Center for Homeless Assistance, which is Hope Faith. Really a great effort, and again, demonstrating the power of social workers and libraries cooperating together. One of my favorite things I get to do is work with local community organizations. I've mentioned the Kansas City Election Board and Hope Faith, but I also get to work with the Whole Person, which is a social services organization for people with disabilities. I work with the Girl Scouts and others, including, of course, the League of Women Voters, the NAACP, and RevEd KC. I've invited them to join me for events on National Voter Registration Day this September. And I'm really hopeful we'll work together. I actually have a meeting later this week to talk about that. And if we could go to the next slide, it pulls just a few examples together. In the upper left-hand corner is a tweet I sent out. This was part of my partnership with the Girl Scouts, but also a local arts community. It was somehow really freezing cold in October. And we had everybody come in to this event where they could color in posters about voting. They could register to vote. They could, ask questions, all that. We also, the bottom picture there is of me at an outreach event at our health department, the Kansas City Health Department, because a lot of what we do with, oh, thank you. Yep. A lot of what we get to do is meet people where they are. You're already going to go to the health department for immunization records or vital documents. Let's make sure you're registered to vote. Let's make sure you understand what's going to be on the ballot. And then that's Kendra right there in the middle from the whole person, sharing information about her organization, but also it's sort of a voter registration drive too. And the last picture there is of John from the Kansas City Election Board showing people how voting machines work, because sometimes it can be intimidating if you show up to vote and you're like, I don't know how this works. Are you going to stop and ask somebody? How much better to be familiar with the machines and also know how they are adaptive if you need accommodations. My outreach events at community centers and also at Operation Breakthrough this summer are really focused on connecting with caregivers and parents so they can verify that they are registered to vote if they aren't already registered, and when it's available, providing that nonpartisan information about what's on the ballot. What does a yes mean? What does a no mean? And I'm really excited too. This just happened this year, partnering with the Kansas City Star, our newspaper reporters at some of those events, because what they want to do is build a voter guide that's based on real life questions from people that they meet. And I'm sure I've forgotten some things, but it's just a real great joy for me to be able to do this. And I realize that not all libraries have the kind of teams that we have or the ability to do the kind of outreach that we have, but I hope I've given you a sense of what's possible. And I really encourage you to check out your local libraries about what they can do with you and with your community. And if your local library, or if you would like to know more about what we're doing and how we're doing it, I really hope that you would connect with me. Jenny Garman at kclibrary.org, 816-701-3732 if you'd rather call. I really, truly enjoy collaborating with community partners, with other librarians, and creating better ways to serve our community. Thank you so much.
Thank you both, Julie and Jenny, for presenting and sharing all of that awesome information today. And it was really cool to see the pictures as well and see all the beautiful work that's happening in action. I did see some questions come in again, and we have both of the presenters' emails on the slide right now, but we'll also share it in the follow-up information or in the chat if I'm able to put it in the chat. Yeah, Jenny just put their email in the chat, and I'll put Julie's again in the chat a little bit later. One of the questions that did come up is, I think, a very important point. It was brought up by Asada. It says, any efforts made with shelters or transitional housing that write up residents when they miss check-ins? So, for example, if they did want to go to the library but get written up by their transitional housing. And then Asada also shared that they were written up for picking up a children's certificate for participating in a local summer reading program. And I just want to express just my sympathies for that, because I know that that's really messed up, especially since you're trying to participate in the community. But if y'all have any suggestions for that or any ways that programs can address that as well.
Asking about the, I don't know, the 2 years, 3 years, 4 years, 5 years, 10 years, 20 years, 30 years, 40 years, 50 years, 60 years, 70 years, 80 years, 90 years, 100 years, 200 years, 300 years, 400 years, 500 years, 600 years, 700 years, 800 years, 900 years, 1000 years, 2000 years, 3000 years, 4000 years, 5000 years, 6000 years, 7000 years, 8000 years, 9000 years, 100 years, 200 years, 300 years, 400 years, 500 years, 600 years, 700 years, 800 years, 900 years, 1000 years, 2000 years, 3000 years, 4000 years, 5000 years, 6000 years, 7000 years, 8000 years, 100 years, 200 years, 300 years, 400 years, 500 years, 600 years, 700 I'm just so horrified by the idea that somebody be written up to do that. I'm like still reeling from that. But I would be interested in talking, Asada, if you would wanted to reach out to me, I'd be interested in hearing more about that and see, I'd like to bring that up with library people that work in libraries and the social workers that work in libraries and see what could be done. If there was some way of helping to mitigate that or make a difference or at least address it and know that it's happening. So if you want to reach out to me, I would really appreciate it. I'd be happy to have a conversation about it.
Thank you so much, Julie. And then folks who are joining us by the phone, somebody asked the organization that does work with people with disabilities, and that organization was The Whole Person. There was also another question that came in through the Q&A asking if somebody's going to be registering voters for the Poor People's March on June 18th, which is this Saturday in Washington, D.C. I'll be sharing more information on that march at the end of the call, but I did do a quick check like while you all were speaking to see if there was any information on that, and I wasn't able to find anything, but if they're not, then that is a good recommendation that we can share with the folks organizing that march moving forward. So thank you, Beth, for bringing up that question. I don't see any other questions as of right now, but if you have any questions, folks, please feel free to keep asking them in the chat or the Q&A, and we'll go ahead and move forward with our next speakers. But thank you, Julie and Jenny, for joining us today and sharing your knowledge with us. We'll go ahead and now move to Teresa Clark from the Washington Low Income Housing Alliance. Teresa, take it away.
Thanks, Sid. Yeah, thank you all. I'm happy to be here. I was an organizer for about 15 years before I moved into the role that I have now. And it's been a bit since I've gotten to revisit some of the voter engagement work that I and my teams have done. So this feels fun to talk about. I know that I don't have to convince you all why we shouldn't overlook the so-called low propensity voters. Here is a small Canvas project that we did that I think makes a strong case for why we should seek out residents of affordable homes in particular in voter registration and voter turnout work. This was all the way back in 2016. It was a very small project. It was in Washington State, where we already have strong voter registration systems and where we are totally vote by mail. That year in Vancouver, there was an affordable housing levy on the ballot. And as I think most of you probably know, but in case you don't, while 501c3 organizations, of course, can't legally support or oppose candidates who are running for office, we are allowed to publicly support or oppose ballot initiatives. So our goals with this project were to register new voters and update inactive voter registrations to make sure that people knew about and hopefully turned out in support of that affordable housing levy. And then we also use this as an opportunity to bring new members into the Resident Action Project, which is our statewide network of residents of affordable homes and people who have experienced housing insecurity. So on the screen are some of the highlights of the project. We knocked on 611 doors, 3 of us in 3 days, in 4 different affordable housing communities that were run by 2 of our members, the Vancouver Housing Authority and Reach Community Development. And before we came, we shared a flyer with those housing providers and asked them to post it up for us in common areas and elevators, by the mailboxes. And the flyer was co-branded with our logo and their logo. And it said which day we'd be coming to knock on doors, why we were going to be there, and basically just, ask people to say hi to us when we came by. We knew that that would be an important trust building step, especially in secure buildings where, people just aren't used to having a stranger canvasser come knock on their door. So when we were on the doors, we asked people if their voter registrations were up to date. And if they said no, or they weren't sure, we were ready to be like, no problem. We can take care of that for you right now. What's your last name? And then we would just start filling out the paper voter registration form right there. And and then ask them to look everything over to sign it. We would keep the forms with us and let people know that we'd be delivering them in person to whichever county elections office later that day or the next day. We also asked people to pledge to vote by filling out a simple postcard that we would mail back to them the week that ballots were going to arrive in their mailbox. And then we shared information on that housing levy, and we encouraged people to support it. So overall, we registered 77 people and collected 118 pledge to vote postcards from those residents. And of those people who pledged to vote, 51% ended up voting, and about a quarter of those were first-time voters. So we wanted to kind of like put the results in some context, right? We knew that you could find easily that voter turnout in Clark County in the 2016 general election was like 77.3%. But we expected that voter turnout among residents of affordable housing would be lower, right? Just based on our past experiences doing electoral outreach. So to better analyze our results, we compared them against voter registration and voter turnout in similar nearby buildings that we did not have time to canvass. So on the next slide is kind of more detailed information about that. We found that voter registration increased almost 10% among residents living in the buildings that we canvassed. And voter turnout among those residents also increased by over 10% between the 2012 and 2016 general elections. And when I remember doing this like research and thinking, oh, I should probably really be comparing to the 2008 election, since that was also a presidential election year. And I was surprised to find that the gains were actually even more significant when I compared it to 2008, which was cool. So, and then by comparison, the voter registration and turnout only increased 2% over the same time spans in the similar buildings nearby that we didn't get to during this project. Yeah, other highlights. So among the people we made contact with on the doors, our voter registration rates were 29% higher than before our canvass, and then voter turnout was 10% higher than among neighbors in the buildings that we didn't have time to canvass. I see a question. Do we have data on those voters who received and completed pledge cards? How many actually voted? Yes, I think so. So we had 118 pledged to vote, and 51% of those actually voted, which I think my screen is super small right now, but I think that that's that might be one of the numbers on the screen. I simplified this chart a little bit. So those were kind of the results. On the next slide, I'll sort of summarize what worked for us. Number one was just leaning on our relationships with housing providers. I think most importantly, this, and like logistically, it just gave us access to those secure buildings where we couldn't just walk up from the street and knock on doors. But it's a great way to learn about what housing providers are already doing to support voter engagement among their residents and where they might need your help. You can also learn about the residents before you go so that you know which languages you'll need to be prepared to do outreach in, for instance. And then depending how deep you are in this work, the other thing, like if you can, it's so powerful to get resident leaders to join your canvas or to lead your canvas. Obviously, people are just gonna be more trusting of folks that they already know. So if you can have neighbors organizing neighbors, that's a really powerful thing. My next tip is to let residents know that you're coming in advance if you can. So, flyers in elevators or at mailboxes work great. If possible, try to co-brand that with the housing provider. Having their, endorsement of your voter registration drive will just make people more likely to trust you. I always recommend knocking on doors. It's more effective than, making phone calls or doing text. So if you can, encourage you to get out and actually knock on people's doors. Another tip that I always give people is, rather than asking, are you registered to vote? Ask, is your voter registration up to date? We know voter registrations can go inactive if somebody moves or they just haven't voted in a while. At least that's true in Washington State. So this is a great way to just cast a wider net with the question that you're asking. I also think people are just so used to hearing, are you registered to vote, that it can trigger this sort of automatic brush off of being like, yeah, I'm good. And so asking the question this way, I think, makes someone think for just a split second longer. That makes it a lot easier to stay in the conversation with them. I recommend using just really simple leave behinds. Ours were quarter page, had hardly any text on them, just like something that makes it really easy for people to take action if they see that they missed you, and that we just want to make sure their voter registration is up to date and the link to do that. Some of the voter registrations we got were paper forms, that we collected there on the doors, and some of them were the result of people registering to vote later when they saw our flyer. If your Secretary of State offers something like a unique URL for organizations to use when they're conducting voter registration drives, that can be a great tool for being able to really accurately track how many people you're registering to vote. And then if you can, it's nice to post something fun and informal, food, where people can just drop in to get questions answered about voting, or to learn about any ballot measures that you're supporting. Let's see, question, do you use social media like TikTok and email blasts? Yeah, I think those are great tools to use. I don't really know much about TikTok, but I know that like on Facebook, you can get pretty granular with targeted ads that are not super expensive and can be a cool way to reach certain demographics of people or people with certain interests. Email blasts, absolutely. The pledge to vote postcards that we used had a spot for people to give us their email, so that we were not just physically mailing back the postcard where they pledged to themselves that they would vote, but we were also sending them follow-up emails. So yeah, I think using all those tools is definitely helpful. And then, do the voter population know about the judges who are running in their local elections and statewide elections? That's a good question. We, since we were doing a 501c3 nonpartisan voter engagement drive, we weren't talking about candidate races. But I think in general, especially among people who aren't already voting regularly, they're just going to have lots of questions about voting. So I think being prepared to answer basic questions about, even though you're not going to be, endorsing particular candidates, being prepared to answer questions about what kinds of questions people will be able to weigh in on when they're voting, right? That they're going to vote for their state legislators, and those people do these things, and they're going to be able to vote for school board, and those people do these things, and they're going to be able to weigh in on advisory votes and what that means. Just kind of being prepared to answer those kinds of questions when you're out doing outreach. And those are the conversations that I actually love the most when I'm on the doors. I think it makes a huge difference when people just feel like they understand the process a little bit more. You can see them start to light up about realizing that maybe they do know enough to feel confident about voting. I think often people think that it's more complicated than it is. Yeah, thanks for those questions. And then there's another recommendation in the chat for a specific group in Missouri that has information about judges who are running. Thanks for that. Cool. So my last slide has some resources that I use myself and recommend. I often consult Boulder Advocacy for resources on engaging in electoral work as a nonpartisan nonprofit. So these are a few links that might be helpful, especially if you need to convince your organization or your board that it's okay to do electoral work as a nonprofit. And then I didn't have time to put these together, but I also have examples of some of those flyers that I mentioned and that we actually used, and also a voter registration guide that I put together for housing providers years ago. And I can share those with people if that's helpful. So just email me if you'd like to see some of those examples. That's all I've got.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Teresa. I don't think we have any other questions. You answered them all, so thank you so much for that. But I just want to give you a huge shout out for like the research that you did, but also to the outreach that the team did in past years and now, because I feel like that's a lot of doors to knock on. So kudos to that and to the tips that were being shared by yourself and folks in the chat. Just like getting that verbiage and engaging folks, I think is really important. And I think along those lines, I also had a question myself, kind of related to language justice and access to that. Like, how did your team kind of incorporate that into their work and making sure that folks who aren't native like English speakers were also receiving access to this information?
Yeah, I think we're starting to do a better job of that as an organization than we were like back in the year that this particular example is from. But again, I think just like, you know, don't just sort of like show up in a community that you know nothing about. Find out who lives there, connect with a housing provider before you go, you know, understand who they serve, understand what languages that they speak. I think that so much electoral work is just so much more effective when it's connected to organizing work. So if your organization has the capacity to be like building relationships with residents and getting them engaged in not only voting, but in other advocacy throughout the year, I think that when you can start to build relationships with them, it can just kind of naturally increase your capacity to be able to reach people, to build a multilingual team that's doing outreach. And, you know, I'll share, like, my organization is in a process of having this like reality check about how much money we really need to put into our budget to support interpretation and to support translation services. Especially because we do organizing and outreach and, you know, host meetings that we want people to be able to participate in if English is not their first language. So I think also just plan for that and, you know, pay people to join you who can speak the languages that you want to reach people in.
Well, thank you for that feedback and for answering my questions. You're getting a lot of positive feedback in the chat, so I'll let you check that out. But yeah, thank you so much again, Teresa, for joining us. And if folks have any more questions for Teresa, feel free to drop them in the chat. But we'll go ahead and move on to our next presenter, our very own Dan Emanuel, joining us to talk about the National Preservation Database. And I'll go ahead and let you take it away, Dan.
All right, thanks, Sid. I'm going to share my screen real quick here so you all can see my slides. And then we'll start up the slideshow. So I'm going to take a little bit of a step back from what Teresa was just talking about. And I'm going to talk a little bit about kind of like the nuts and bolts of identifying federally assisted properties so you can start actually building a list of tenants for voter engagement efforts. And specifically, I'm going to talk about how you can use the National Housing Preservation Database for voter engagement efforts. So what is the NHPD? Well, the NHPD is a research tool that we, NLHC, created along with the Public and Affordable Housing Research Corporation for identifying federally subsidized housing. Its primary use is actually for preservation research and also trying to identify properties at risk of loss from the affordable housing stock. It was also a very important tool for us in developing our CARES Act eviction moratorium database. really it was kind of like the basis for that. And then we added in, data from the GSEs and FHA. So it has many uses. The primary use, though, is for preservation research. But today, I'm talking a little bit how we can use NHPD as a starting point to guide voter engagement efforts and actually begin building a voter list of residents in assisted housing. And we're going to walk through how to identify assisted properties and share that data through a basic map. And we're going to use tools that are free and accessible to basically people of nearly all skill levels. And primarily, we're going to use the NHPD itself and then Google Maps. And in my example, I use Excel, but you could also use free software like OpenOffice. So to get started, the first thing you're going to want to do is navigate over to www.preservationdatabase.org. And if you are not already a registered user, you'll see there's kind of like a taskbar here in the middle of the screen. You'll click on that register button and become a registered user of the database. It's totally free for anybody that's basically not a for-profit entity. And once you've registered the database, you can go ahead and you can click on that. You'll click on that little login button there, and you'll put in your credentials, you'll sign in, and then you'll be prompted with this big blue button that says data access. And you'll click on that. And then your next step here is you're going to apply your subsidy filters. So the first thing you do there is you navigate to that the subsidy status drop-down menu, and you need to pick active. And you should probably also pick inconclusive, particularly if you're going to look at project-based Section 8 properties, because we list those as inconclusive essentially while they're in the contract renewal process. So there's kind of a constant churn of inconclusive properties that are in fact actually active. So after you've selected your subsidy statuses, you can go down to the program menu right under drop down right underneath that, and you can essentially pick out whatever subsidy types you want to look at. So if you're interested in looking at, project-based Section 8, you click that. LIHTC, you click that. Public housing, whatever, right? Basically, the two main things we have almost all federal project-based subsidies in the database. What we're missing would be obviously housing choice vouchers, and then National Housing Trust Fund. We're still working on importing trust fund data into the database. So once you've selected your programs that you're interested in looking at properties for, you just hit the Apply Filters button, and it will literally filter down to all of those criteria. You select it in the grid that you see below there. And in the top row of that grid, there are actually text boxes that you can use to further sort your data. So for example, you could enter the city you're interested in looking at, the state, or the zip code. All right, or if you look a little bit further over that right red box, you can even enter a congressional district. You might even be interested in identifying assisted properties in. And once you've done that, you filter down by your geographies, you just hit this Export Filter Grid button, and you're going to hit the Export Properties button within that. And what you'll essentially get is you'll start downloading the Excel file, essentially. And each row in that Excel file is going to be a federally assisted property that meet the criteria that you've just set out. And you can go ahead, and there's going to be a bunch of unnecessary columns that you can go through and you delete in there. But some ones you'll probably want to keep are the property name, the property address, city, state, zip. Total unit counts are useful for essentially just knowing how much literature you need to bring with you. And then you want to keep the Latin long as well, and then maybe the county and congressional district if that's necessary. And you'll just go ahead and save that on your computer. And then you'll head over to Google Maps. Everybody knows how to do that. And then in the right top corner of Google Maps, you have this little 3 horizontal bar kind of sign or menu button, and you'll click on that. And you're going to navigate down to something called Your Places, and you click on Your Places, and then you'll click over on the Maps tab there at the top. And then after you've clicked on the Maps tab, you'll be prompted at the very bottom there. You'll see there's an option to create map, and you will click on that. And then once you've clicked on that, you'll see over on the left, there's going to be something that says Untitled Layer, Import. And you click on the Import button, and you'll be prompted with this window you see right here in the center of the screen. And you'll click select a file from your computer. And basically, you're just going to pick your Excel file that you downloaded from NHPD, right? And then once you do that, it's going to ask you which columns you want to use to position your place marks. So essentially what it's asking for is the data that Google is going to use to geolocate the properties in your spreadsheet. And I would suggest maybe actually using the property address, city, state, and zip code for a reason I will explain later, but you also feel free to just use the latitude and the longitude. And then once you do that, it will prompt you, it'll ask you to choose your column title for your markers. And this is basically how you're labeling each of the markers that appears in your map. And I think probably the most logical choice there is just the property name. So you'll click on property name and hit finish. And then what's going to happen is Google is going to take all of your spreadsheet and it will geocode your spreadsheet, each of the properties in your spreadsheet, right? And you'll get kind of like this preview of all of that. And you can go through and you can click on any one of those markers and you can kind of ground truth the data that you've just geocoded using Google, right? And that's always, pro tip, very good idea. Anytime you geocode stuff, always ground truth it, because geocoders make mistakes all the time, even Google. So once you do that, right, you can kind of check things out. You can see here I've selected Potomac Gardens. I live right by there. So once you've done that, you kind of like checked out, how well things have geocoded, right? Your next step is you probably want to add a title and a description of your map. So if you look over on the left, it's a little hard to see here, but you'll just click where it says Untitled Map. And it will prompt you with this window here, and you can enter a map title and a little description for your map so you know what it is when you look at it, a year from now or something. And then once you've done that, you can just go in. You'll see over here in this box again, this is kind of like your main window for making changes to the map, right? There's like a little paint roller button. And if you click on that paint roller button, I won't show you here, but if you click on that paint roller button, you get all kinds of different options to stylize your markers. Here, for example, what I've done is I've actually used the options in there to group the markers, each of the properties by unit count, and then color code accordingly, right? So it might be useful to know that like the darker properties here have more units in them. So maybe we want to hit those places first because it's more efficient to go knock on doors there, right? Once you've done that, another kind of option you'll see in that same kind of window I just showed you, there's like a little vertical three dots, right? And if you click on that, you actually open up an opportunity to edit your table. So like earlier, what I mentioned was you should probably, it might be a good idea to geocode the addresses instead of using latitude and longitude. And the reason for that is that you actually have the opportunity to add and delete data here. And if you hit the add row button and enter an address, say you found some locally subsidized property that wouldn't be in the NHPD, right? Once if you find something like that, you hit the add row button here, and you literally just put in the address, and then Google will automatically geocode it for you, and it will put it into your map. So that could be a very useful function. Or if you find properties that are a mistake, or like maybe they've recently become inactive or something, you can also delete those properties out of here. And then finally, the last step here would be to share the map. So over in that same window, you would just hit the little share button and it will prompt you with some options for who you want to be able to see your map. And it will give you a little link, and you can literally share that link with anybody that you want to go out and knock on doors with. And once you've done that, literally anybody can take out a map and see it on their phone and go knock on doors, right? So that being said, what I've given you here is just a very good, it's a good place to start, right? So you might start here, right? Geocode your properties, identify the properties themselves. And then when you're knocking on doors, then you can start creating an address level database or a unit level database for, within the property. So you can actually identify households as a row in a new database, right? And then you can track your engagement with voters there. And Our Homes, Our Votes has a number of toolkits you can use to try to figure out how to set up a database like that, an actual unit level database. So that would really be the next step here. So with that being said, I will stop sharing my screen here. and open it up for any questions folks might have.
Thanks, Dan. I don't see any questions in regards to the database right now. But like you said, we'll share your information with folks just so that they have that available to them to reach out if they have any questions moving forward. We did have one question come in. I'm not sure if we'll be able to dive deep into it because I feel like it's a really good question, but we only have about 5 minutes left. But Carol did ask a very important question. How do I overcome fear of getting into trouble for being politically active? Here in my Section 8 senior housing, the older folks who are in their 80s and 90s are scared of rocking the boat or speaking up. And we did have Teresa and Julie both share kind of their thoughts. Really quickly, Julie or Teresa, if you want to share your thoughts off mute, I'll happily invite you to come off mute for that. But I just want to make sure that you get to share your thoughts.
Hi, yeah, this is Julie. I'll turn on my video for a second. Oh, and I'll take my Post-it off my camera.
No, that happens to me all the time too.
This is a really, to me, this is a really good example of how if a library knew about this, and if you reached out to somebody like me or, another, just if you reached out to a library and just said, this is what's going on, I think that you might find somebody who'd be really interested in following up. It's just the kind of thing that you don't hear about at libraries because it's like one library out of all of the libraries in the country might do something exactly like this. They do a lot of small group and a lot of support things and a lot of informational, bringing people together. That's what they do. So that's what I would recommend is just check with the library and see. And if you don't, and persist. That's another thing I always tell people. If you check with a library, persist, because you might reach out to somebody and they're really busy and then you think they're ignoring you, but they're not. So that's my comment about it.
And Jenny second that comment in the chat. Thank you so much, Julie, for providing that feedback too. I know it can be hard to get involved. I'll be the first one to admit that it can be kind of scary when you don't have that experience under your belt. Teresa, I just saw that you unmuted. Go ahead.
Yeah, I really like Julie's answer to this. And I think I have similar instincts about organize people into a conversation with other people. I think is a great thing to try. I think, people usually feel fear about something for real reasons and for good reasons. And I think that if it's like, you're not part of that generation or you're not part of the culture that's going to really be able to deeply understand why it feels scary, then plan to go slowly and make room for people to talk and to take some small steps. So that's all I would add.
Thank you so much, Teresa. I just want to go ahead and go back to Dan's presentation. You got some kudos, Dan, in the chat, just thanking you for going over this resource. I'm sure a lot of folks will benefit from being able to use the database as well. And Courtney also shared a sample unit level database for voter engagement at the end of the document that was just linked in the chat. So that's available to everybody. And really quickly, I'm just going to close us off. And I firstly want to thank all of the speakers that joined us today. Thank you so much for sharing your knowledge with us. And again, we'll share their information in the follow-up so that you all have that. As one of our attendees mentioned today, the Poor People's Campaign, which is a partner with NLIHC, will be hosting the Mass Poor People's and Low Wage Workers Assembly and Moral March on Washington and to the polls this Saturday, June 18th. And the march will be generationally transformative and impactful in gathering poor and low wage workers, state leaders, faith communities, moral allies, unions, and partnering agencies. And it's not just the day of action. This is meant to be kind of like a declaration of ongoing work towards, building power and making policies that actually address poverty and low wealth from the bottom up. And so we shared that link earlier, but we'll go ahead and share that as well in the follow-up and probably in the chat if we're able to get to it. And then the next webinar will be on June 27th, 2 weeks from now, and we'll be talking about the role that housing providers have in registering and mobilizing voters, and we'll drop that registration link in the chat. We also have a bi-weekly newsletter that you will automatically be signed up for if you register for these calls, so keep an eye out for that in the end of the week. And please follow our campaign, Our Homes, Our Votes. You can follow us on Twitter at Our Homes Votes and on Facebook at OHOV 2022. And you can also email us at ourhomes@nlhc.org. And again, our website, ourhomes-ourvotes.org. And that is all I have for you all today. Thank you so much for joining us, and we'll see you next time. Bye-bye, everybody.